Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. March 27th, it is officially spring, even though in Toronto, I know it doesn't look that way. But we can all get our hopes up that the sun is going to continue to shine. Sorry for the few-minute delay. Robert Hough is here with us today. Rob, welcome to Junction Reads. We're going to talk about The Marriage of Rose Camilleri today, and I'm so excited.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it was a fantastic book. Before we officially get started, I'm going to share an acknowledgement of land. I invite everyone who's joining us here today, if you feel comfortable, to share your own acknowledgement in the chat or just a personal acknowledgement of where you find yourself in this moment today. Junction Reads exists in Tekaronto, which for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Wendat Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. I am joining you today from the unceded territory of the Endakina, also called New Hampshire. It is the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and the Wabanaki people, past and present. I am honored and grateful to work on the land Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island have stewarded through the generations. Rob, again, welcome to Junction Reads.
Thank you.
Normally, we give the audience a few minutes to settle down and we talk about what you're reading right now, but I'm going to ask you to give us your 5 favorite books of all time or currently.
No, this is of all time. You know,
oh, nice.
As an author, I do get asked this quite often, you know, who are your favorite authors? And the question would always sort of catch me off guard.
Mm-hmm.
And so finally I thought, okay, I'm going to prepare a list. And I just went through, I have a shelf in my dining room called the Wall of Favorites, where all my favorite books are. There's about 100 books there. And I just went through them and picked the 5 that I'd read the most often. So all of these books I've read about 4 or 5 times. Okay, first one, The Buddha of Suburbia by Hanif Qureshi. Interestingly enough, when I was trying to learn how to write, this came out, and I really didn't know how to write novels yet. And I thought that there was something in the structure of novels that was the secret to them. So I went through this one, I don't know if you can see, and made notes on how the book was structured. Like I said, I had no idea. You know, novels live and breathe by the strengths of their characters. Mark Halperin, Memoir from Ant-Proof Case. I just love his stuff because his protagonists are sort of half superhero and half raving crackpot. And that one's the most fabulous of his books. Stephen Toltz, he's an Australian guy, Fraction of a Whole. Gould's Book of Fish, Richard Flanagan. There we are. He later went on to win the Booker with the series book. But I think this is his masterpiece. And then finally, probably my favorite book of all time, The Thought Gang by Tibor Fischer. He's kind of a Hungarian English writer. This book is about this guy. He's a dissolute prof at Oxford. He gets thrown out of Oxford. He loses his job because he steals money from the university. So he goes to France and he hooks up with a one-armed bank robber and they go on a bank robbing spree throughout France. It's the only novel that has kind of a catchphrase. I rob, therefore I am.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so it's philosophers robbing banks, basically. And the language is extremely rich and unusual. And so I'll leave that with people. If there's one thing you're going to get from today, go read The Thought Gang by Tibor Fischer. Nice.
Kaylee's going to be sharing links to all of them in the chat, so feel free to copy and paste. It always amazes me when I find or hear about books by authors I've never heard or read before. And then you read the synopses and I think, man, how at least has this not been made into a film or something, you know, when philosophers robbing banks, it feels just so necessary that it be turned into.
Funny, you should mention that because I wrote a screenplay for The Thought Gang. I was so, because I do some screenwriting as well. And so I thought this would make the perfect movie. And without even seeing or just finding out whether the rights were available, I just wrote a rough draft of a screenplay for the book, just to sort of
Super
see
fun.
how it would work out. But then I discovered that the author had given film rights in perpetuity to some scoundrel who's never going to make a movie of it. So but it's a cult novel, so maybe it shouldn't be a movie. It should just exist as this one perfect little unlikely thing
Right.
that I found out at this weirdo bookstore on Bloor Street called Zoinks Books. So maybe it's a good
I
thing,
am
but yeah,
familiar.
it should be a movie.
I've driven by there a million times. That's great. So we, unfortunately, but I am glad that you made this decision for you and the book. We're not going to hear you read today, but we're going to have an incredible discussion about this book. I hope that everyone will enjoy it. If you have questions about the book, if you have questions about writing or anything, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll welcome you into the Q&A at the end. But before we get started, Rob, is it okay that I share your biography and a little personal summary of the book?
Sure, go right ahead.
Great. Robert Hough is the author of The Final Confession of Mabel Stark, which was shortlisted for both the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for the Best First Book and the Trillium Book Award. He's the author of The Stowaway, which was one of the Boston Globe's top 10 fiction titles of 2004, and The Culprits. He's also the author of Dr. Brinkley's Tower, which was shortlisted for the Governor General's Award for Fiction and longlisted for the Giller Prize. The Man Who Saved Henry Morgan was a finalist for the Trillium Book Award, and Diego's Crossing was shortlisted for the Arthur Ellis Award. Robert Hough has been published to rave reviews in 15 territories around the world, and he lives in Toronto. The Marriage of Rose Camilleri is your 7th novel. The novel, I tried to summarize this in my own words and keep it without reading it, and I apologize that I just can't do that. I don't have that kind of memory, but the novel opens in the present. Rose Camilleri, soon to be currently Rose Larkin, is making a rabbit stew for her husband, Scott. We travel back with her to Malta in the middle of an apocalyptic locust storm, and her parents decide, as a result of the locust storm, to send her to Canada to live with her aunt in the Junction neighborhood of Toronto. She starts working at a pastizzi bakery, which, if anyone knows the Junction, was at one time famous for. There was a dozen of them easy along Dundas Street West. Within months of meeting Scott in the cafe where she works, she's pregnant with her son, Claudio, and married. Another pregnancy soon follows, and her daughter, Christina, is born. Rose obsesses about these past passionate relationships that she once had while trying to find her place in this new relationship, this new complacent, boring marriage. It's not about falling in love so much as it's a story about discovering love. That's my summary of this great book.
Yeah, that's you pretty much nailed it. It's exuberant young Maltese woman learns to love her ex-criminal husband over a 25-year marriage.
Yes.
Yeah. It's kind of the inverse of most marriage books. How many marriage novels and marriage movies have you seen in which the relationship burns white hot at the beginning and then fizzles to this kind of stagnant ennui? I mean, every John Updike novel ever written was about that. So I thought I'd flip it around. She meets this guy, like I say, he's had a criminal past. For reasons I won't reveal, she feels obligated to marry him.
Mm-hmm.
And then she's saddled with the challenge of learning how to love him. And that's the book in a nutshell. It's her trying to do that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when you read a novel that has such strong central characters, and not just Rose and Scott, but Claudio and Christina, and Rose's aunt. There aren't a lot of tertiary characters. Like there aren't a lot of people floating around the book. It really is centralized on these people. And I sort of felt like it wasn't just Rose trying to love Scott, but also trying to love herself while also trying to figure out how to love Christina because of who she has become, and Claudio because of his other passions and who he's become. What made you, what brought you to Rose? What brought you to her life as
Scotty did. Scotty did. So I'll tell you a story. About 10 years ago, 7 years ago, when my fourth novel came out, Dr. Brinkley's Tower, I was doing a reading in Kingston, Ontario. So this woman comes up to me and she says, I'm a big fan. And I was like, great. I really wasn't aware that I had any. And she said, would you like to come to my book club? And I said, sure. If you're my fan, sure. And she said, there's one little catch. And I said, what's that? And she goes, it's in Millhaven Penitentiary. Yeah, she was the librarian at Millhaven Penitentiary.
Wow.
And she ran a book club there. So I visited the book club at Millhaven, which is our version of a supermax prison in Canada. And it was terrifyingly claustrophobic. That's all I can tell you, because first you get locked in the prison, and then you get locked in the unit of the prison, then you get locked in the ward of the unit of the prison, then you get locked in the section of the ward of the unit of the prison, then you get locked in the floor of the section of the ward of the, on and on, and finally you're locked in the library with 7 murderers. They were lovely, don't get me wrong, one of them made cookies. They were fine. It was just how claustrophobic it was.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Anyway, my book, the book they were doing was my second novel, which was an escape tale, and it caught on in the Canadian penal system. And for a while, it was the most popular novel in the Canadian penal system. So I got kind of interested in what makes a criminal.
Right.
And what are criminals all about? And so I did a little bit of research and found this interesting fact. 95% of adolescents who get in trouble with the law just naturally straighten out.
Right.
Yeah, who knew?
Yeah.
They tend to recognize that a life of crime is no life to have. And they just naturally stop breaking the law. And I thought, how interesting that with all the movies I've seen, all the novels I've read with criminals in them, I've never seen that person represented. They're always Tony Soprano. They're always hardcore criminals, with this antisocial, deviant type personalities, So I wanted to write a book about the life and times of a typical criminal. Someone who gets in a lot of trouble as an adolescent.
Yeah.
In his
and
case,
then goes on to live.
He goes to juvenile detention, otherwise known as juvie, and gets out and straightens some stuff out. So that's Scotty.
Yeah.
I wanted to give him a wife, a love interest. And so I thought, well, I live in Toronto, where everyone's from everywhere. And so my natural instinct is to give them a different nationality. And I remember very briefly I was going to make her Mexican, the wife. But I'd done a Mexican novel already. And just for some reason, the country of Malta popped into my head. I don't know why, it just did. I am a fan of the Junction. I do like that neighborhood, and I always noticed Little Malta, which is this tiny little 3 or 4 block enclave of Maltese people at the outskirts of this Toronto neighborhood called the Junction.
Yeah.
So I figured that was it. That was why I made the wife Maltese.
Yeah.
So I'm writing away. And then one day it occurred to me, and this was a suppressed memory. When I was in grade 10, I had the biggest crush on this girl in school, and her name was Roselle Piccinini, and she was Maltese.
Wow.
Yeah. And I don't know why it never occurred to me that maybe this is the reason. Oh, they had the same first name even. Rose. So suddenly out of the blue, I've been writing this book for a year.
Yeah.
I remembered this girl, Roselle Piccinini, whom I thought was fantastic. We had music and math back to back, and she let me walk her from music to math, which she didn't have to do. She was way out of my league. She was very nice about it.
Right.
So what I thought, so what do you do when you remember someone? You look them up online.
Yeah.
I found her in a minute on Facebook.
Yeah.
So there she was. And the weird thing was, I didn't recognize her at all. She looked fantastic, by the way.
Aging changes everything.
Well, that's what I thought at first. Maybe this is what happens when you haven't seen someone for 40 years.
Right.
Right? So then what I did was I began stalking all these people I knew in high school.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to say stalking.
And found all these people I knew in high school online. And it was a completely different experience. It was like, oh yeah, I'd recognize that guy in a million years. Oh, her I could pick out of a parade, because the brain is very good at recognizing faces. Every other person I recognized immediately, except her, whom I'd stared at with this longing for a full year. I didn't recognize her at all. And it occurred to me that that's what high school crushes all are. They're just complete projection. I kind of invented what I thought, the 15-year-old version of me was the perfect girl, and kind of broadcasted it on her features somehow. It's just the most amazing thing. Anyway, so I have this book, and it's going to be the life and times of this criminal named Scotty, this ex-criminal, this reformed criminal. And so I wrote the first couple drafts in his voice.
Yeah.
And it just wasn't really working out so well. He was just too kind of stoic and tight-lipped.
Yeah.
And then my agent said, who should narrate this book is the wife. She's the one who's funny and mouthy and has kind of a weird take on everything. Why don't you make her the narrator? And as soon as she said that, I knew she was right. It's one of those things where you go, finally, the answer to this book. And then you wake up the next morning and you're like, oh, great. I got to totally rewrite a book in the voice of an 18-year-old Maltese woman.
Right.
Which is why I'm not reading from the book. Because when I read from the book, it just totally destroys the effect of the writing. I can write like Rosie, but I can't speak like her.
Yeah, that would be challenging.
So that's how it became the marriage of Rose Camilleri. She kind of stepped up and became the central figure in the novel. It was completely a case of making a virtue out of necessity.
Yeah, yeah. And so one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was the what came first, Maltese or the Junction, and I'm gonna that's my answer right there. The Freudianness of your life compacted into that unconscious choice. And it's funny because reading, as a person who lived in the Junction for 30 years, the challenge of reading, as you know, the challenge of reading a book set in Toronto, the challenge in a familiar neighborhood, the challenge is when you start reading things that are familiar, like Paragon Press, where Scotty works, it's like, what? Was that an actual press? And it sends you in places. But I still love it. I love books that are set in Toronto, in neighborhoods that I'm very familiar with. And this is your 7th novel and the only novel set entirely in Toronto.
Yes.
Was that something you've wanted to do, or is that happenstance again?
Well, it just kind of worked out that way. The word Toronto actually never appears in the book. I don't know if you noticed. I really thought of it taking place in Little Malta. But to anyone who's from Toronto, it's clearly the city I'm writing about. But I did want people to imagine this tale could happen in any big city. But why did I set a book in Toronto, which I've never done before? I think I never, because I'm Torontonian, born and bred, I just never thought just nothing seemed different about Toronto for me. You know, everything about Toronto I knew too well, so it didn't seem outstanding enough for me to write about. You know, there's this thing where writers often leave the places they were brought up to
Yeah,
figure it out what it is that's interesting about the place, and then they start writing about it.
right.
You know, like Mordecai Richler moves to Greece to write about Montreal, right? That kind of thing. But then what happened was, well, the world banking collapse in 2008, which largely didn't affect Canada because we had a regulated banking system. And I swear every real estate development dollar in the free world came to the city of Toronto. It's been the fastest growing city, Western city, for 10 straight years or something like that.
Oh,
It's just completely changed over the last 10 years. And
yeah,
boy, oh boy, you want to get a writer's attention, put something in flux, you know, get something changing. You
yeah.
know, I just suddenly found myself wanting to write about my hometown, which I never had before. And now I'm just fascinated by it. You know, there's some things I like about the changes that are coming to Toronto. There are things I hate about the changes that are coming to Toronto, but it is changing. And I think that it's so different from the Toronto I grew up in. I mean, you sound like you grew up in Toronto. Oh, you didn't. Sorry. You said you were in the
No,
Junction for 30 years. Okay.
yeah,
I mean, in the 70s, we got our news from Buffalo. We were
yeah,
like a second tier rust bucket, you know, Lake Ontario place on kind of the level of, you know, Rochester or Albany,
yeah,
you know, and now there's what, 6.5 million people in the GHEA. I mean, the transformation is amazing. So I think what happened was the city left me behind,
right. Yeah,
and suddenly it got my attention
yeah.
in a
Well,
big way.
and
And I was
yeah,
going to say,
and
if someone told me I had to write my next 4 novels in Toronto, I'd be fine with it.
yeah, I mean, it's different. These communities, right? Like they mirrored kind of what was happening in England, that there were all these communities that had everything you needed, like, you know, the high street in England, like that was the Junction, like it was the street, and people lived there, and then people from other countries followed them there, like Roncesvalles and so on and so forth. But it's funny how that's expanding and getting bigger and more inviting to different people, because we you know, gentrification is what it is, but we're still more welcoming to people from other countries, and all of these new neighborhoods are popping up. So I agree. I would love to see more novels centered in Toronto, in
Yeah.
a lot of these different neighborhoods.
I mean, the problem with Toronto is it's just getting too damn rich.
Well,
And
yeah.
the problem with rich cities is A, my kids can't afford to live here.
Hmm.
And B, wealth tends to have a homogenizing effect on cities because all the mom and pop joints go out of business because they can't afford the rents.
Hmm.
I don't know the last time you've been in Manhattan, but like everything's a chain, unless you go to Spanish Harlem or someplace like there's a few pockets left. But for the
Yeah.
most part, it's just chains everywhere. So you get this homogenizing effect that I'm really uncomfortable with.
Hmm.
That being said, there still are interesting neighborhoods, and the Junction is certainly one of them. And I always thought of Little Malta as being a super interesting, tiny neighborhood inside a larger, interesting neighborhood, which is the Junction,
Yeah.
inside this big, fascinating place that Toronto has become.
Yeah. Well, it was definitely 30 years ago when I moved there. I grew up in St. Catharines, and when I moved to the Junction, it certainly was a small community. I knew everybody. I walked my daughter down the street in her buggy, and we knew we got free pastizzis, and I got free coffee, and everybody knew everybody. And I love, that's one of the favorite things, was as soon as I opened the book and recognized that that's where we were, I loved that. Your building of this family, Claudio and Christina and Rose and Scotty, what it it's such a beautiful family. Christina is a very unique individual. Claudio is a very unique social justice warrior individual. And I want to talk about where those ideas came from. How did you build this family?
Um, Good question. You know, characteristics bounce around a bit. I think both of the kids are rebellious in their own way. Christina, far more so. She develops a drug problem when she's 15. What I kind of imagined is both Rose and Scotty, her parents, they both went a little wild when they were 15.
Yeah.
And you kind of magnify that trait and you get a Christina.
Yeah.
Claudio, like I say, I think he's a bit of a late bloomer, and his rebellious years don't come till his early 20s. And yeah, he's a social activist.
Yeah.
You know, he's a do-gooder, and he gets that from his aunt.
Lorenza.
Yeah, so that's where they came from. You know, the book is alive with character flaws, despite the fact that they're good people.
Yeah.
They just really are. But both Rose and Scotty bring kind of a marriage crippling trait into their marriage.
Yeah.
Rosie is boy crazy.
Oh yeah. Some
you
of
know,
those scenes.
Yeah, she's mad for the fellas, you know,
Yeah.
and like she grows up in a village of 17 on the tiny Maltese island of Gozo, and she still had 7 lovers by the time she was 18, something like that.
Yeah.
She's just, you know, one of these people who needs the attention of a lover to
Yeah.
feel validated. Not a good thing to carry into a marriage.
Yeah.
Scotty has this kind of criminal default. You know, there deep down inside him, there's a tendency towards criminal behavior. Right?
Yeah.
But they get married because they have to. And they both really struggle to dampen down these personality characteristics that would potentially ruin their marriage. You know, again, with my agent, she said, you know what this book's really about? It's about how if you're going to survive in a long-term relationship, you are going to have to be a better person than you actually are.
Right.
You know, and something, having written this book, I must have believed it beforehand, but didn't realize it. But that's kind of what this book's about. Scotty and Rose just really try hard to tamp down these kind of default mechanisms they have to deal with stress. And they both screw up once or twice in the book. But, you know, they're married for almost 25 years before it comes to an end. So that's pretty good.
Yeah.
You know? And in the end, yeah, they love each other.
Yeah.
And so there are these traits bouncing about. And they land on their kids too. I was also kind of often find in families there are sides, there are teams.
Yeah.
And mom is a lot closer to the son and dad's a lot closer to the daughter. I don't know if you picked up on that. So there's kind of team Scotty, Christina versus team Rosie, Claudio. And I think that happens in families quite a bit. I'm not beholden to this idea that parents always love their children an equal amount. I think even some good, and even if you do love one kid over the other, I don't think it necessarily makes you a bad parent. It's how you deal with that reality. It just, that just makes you human. So, you know, there's some bad traits bouncing about, and I had to give them to their children as well.
Right.
You know, just, it wouldn't have felt right, given who the parents are, for the kids to have gotten off scot-free.
Right.
You know, I didn't want her to,
make them
I didn't want her to, yeah, I didn't want her to be a girl guide and him to go to MIT. You know, it just wouldn't have been very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fantastic. I felt that natural kind of movement of all 4 of them when they're in the same space in the same room. And I totally agree with you. There are, I mean, we have 3 kids, but in our family, the kids choose their team based on the circumstances and the context, right? There's
Yeah,
a
I'm not saying it
winning,
always happens, but it
yeah,
just does happen, I think.
for sure. There's a winning team depending on the situation. And
Yeah,
you want to be
definitely.
on the winning team.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in choosing Rosie as, and in it being suggested that the novel be told from Rosie's perspective, you went even further and chose the first person, which I felt was like an incredibly brave decision in completely revising the novel, not only changing perspectives, but choosing to be so intimately in Rosie's perspective. How challenging was that?
A very, you know,
Yeah.
one word, very.
Yeah.
But I was kind of, like I say, you know, this mantle was thrust upon me. I wrote another novel from first person, from a woman's point of view, my very first one.
Hmm.
So maybe I thought I could do it because of that.
Hmm.
I don't know. It's just clearly a first person kind of book. You know, it's really Rosie writing about her life with her husband.
Yeah.
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 And I just didn't see room for a lot of scenes where Rosie's not present.
Right.
And if you get one character who's in every scene, you better have a good reason not to make it first person.
Yes. Yeah.
And I didn't have one.
Right.
So I just felt obligated to make it first person, you know, from Rosie. And at first her accent was too broad. I toned that down quite a bit, realizing that by the time she narrates the book, she comes when she's 18, but by the time she narrates the book, it's getting towards the end of the marriage.
Hmm.
Um, and so I kind of figured her accent would be toned down quite a bit, but it's still there a little bit. I don't know if you sensed it, but
Yeah, no, I definitely heard it. I mean, I heard it uh, at the beginning when she first arrived in Canada and was speaking English, for sure. I don't know if I noticed that it was toned down. I think I just heard her voice.
well, you wouldn't have seen the drafts in which it was, you know, at volume 8 or 9,
Right.
her accent, you know.
Right.
I mean, the funny thing about Rosie is I discovered that all the private schools are run by Welsh monks in Malta. So she would have learned her English from Welsh monks, which is
Oh,
why there are these little English expressions, you know, like she'll say, do you
yeah.
fancy something instead of do you like something? So I had
Right.
fun playing with that as
But the
well.
Welsh accent is like, I mean, it's
Yeah,
a
no, she still has
sing-songy.
her accent is Maltese, but with these English idioms in there.
Right.
So yeah, it was hard work. I mean, having to rewrite the novel lock, stock, and barrel proved to be a benefit because I think I knew the characters so well by the time, and then I had to start completely over. But this time, I just really knew all the characters. I had just chosen the wrong protagonist for the early drafts.
Yeah. It's hard. I don't know if you want to talk about one of the central themes. I can't actually remember when it comes up, the end of the marriage. But what does play a big part in the novel is Rose's faith, and how it's not necessarily opposed overtly by Scott's choice or Scott's way of living, but it definitely feels at times that she is alone in her faith. And I mean, I think it was a natural choice to make her Catholic and faithful. It would have seemed odd if she weren't. But how did you deal with that in research or in thinking about it or in using it? I'm trying to
Well,
not talk about what is
like I,
at the heart of the book.
People always talk about Catholic guilt,
Mhm.
which may or may not exist. I'm not Catholic myself, so I don't know if Catholics feel any more guilt than anyone else. But I think she does feel guilty because of her proclivities,
Right.
because she likes boys so much, that I think she constantly feels kind of guilty about some of the urges that she has,
Mhm.
particularly when she's under stress. We all have these bad habits, and it's when we're under stress
Mhm.
that we go there, and that was the struggle with both Scotty and Rose, that when things are difficult in their marriage,
Yeah.
they, like everyone else, tends to gravitate towards whatever their bad habits are, if only for a little bit of instantaneous gratification, breaking the stress for just a few minutes.
Mhm.
People do that. And so, yeah, she's a Catholic. And now I don't want to give away the ending of the novel.
Yeah.
I'll say this though, when you meet Scotty, she starts in the present day and then reverts back, and you get their marriage story, and then it catches up. When you
Mhm.
meet him, he's ill.
Mhm.
We know this just by the descriptions of him.
Mhm.
And then we get their whole life story, and we catch back up to them at the end. And it's what he decides to do about his illness that does not sit that well with Rosie's Catholicism. That being said, like, she's not the staunchest Catholic in the world. She goes to church once in a
Yeah.
while. She goes to church when she's in trouble and feeling
Yeah.
needy, you know? So she never kind of puts her foot down. I won't do this because I'm Catholic. She'll
Yeah.
just experience the guilt
Right.
and do it anyway,
Yeah. Yeah.
and let it go.
Yeah.
But yeah, apparently it's a very religious place. Malta, they have the nicest cathedrals in Europe, apparently.
Mhm.
I read this funny statistic. A lot of the cathedrals have 2 clock towers, one with the right time and one with the wrong time. And this was to confuse the devil. So
Wow.
Satan wouldn't come to mass, or if he did, there's a chance he would come on the wrong time.
Oh,
Yeah, so a lot of them have 2 clock towers.
yeah, that's funny. Well, I mean, my kids all went to a Catholic school in my neighborhood, and I would probably say at least a third of their teachers were Maltese. It was um, a a big cultural part of my kids' upbringing. Um,
Really?
yeah,
Huh. Huh.
they went to Saint Cecilia, which is literally across, like, if you go from Malta Park to Annette Street, that's where the kids went to school.
Well, people telling me there's all kinds of Maltese in Canada. There's a really well-known hockey player called Mike Camilleri.
Oh, right.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and get this. So they're in England. There's a well-known horror novelist named Andrea Camilleri. So when Indigo got my book, they just took one look at it and they filed it under horror.
Oh, wow. That's so funny.
I know, this cover, they thought was a horror novel.
That is so funny.
Yeah.
My kids had a teacher, Miss Camilleri. And anyway, I guess it's a popular name. I don't want to continue our conversation without making sure that everyone in the chat knows that they can ask a question if they have any. You can either pose it in the chat or just message it to Kaylee individually, and she will ask on your behalf. But what are you working on right now? This is your 7th novel, and are we going to stay into now?
I'm writing a novel principally about the anarchist Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman, she's sort of the most famous anarchist who ever lived. She was a Russian Jew who left Russia because they were horribly oppressed there, moved to New York City in the 1890s and became an anarchist. And I was looking for something to write about at the beginning of the pandemic. I just thought, who can I write about? Because I have written novels that use real people as characters before.
Yeah.
And just her name popped into my head because she went around giving these firebrand speeches about the evils of the rich, which kind of reminded me of the Occupy movement, and women's issues, which kind of reminded me of Me Too. So I thought that she might be a candidate for a book. And then I thought it'd kind of be interesting if she had a kind of a long-suffering husband, maybe, and he would write the book. He would be the voice of the book.
Right.
Turns out she didn't have a husband because she didn't believe in marriage or monogamy. But she had a lifelong companion, a guy named Alexander Berkman. So their story, they both wrote autobiographies, these guys. He was a well-known anarchist as well. And there's a passage of their lives together. He's a Jew from Russia as well, who also leaves Russia because he's so oppressed there. And they meet in New York City in the Lower East Side, the world headquarters of the anarchist movement. So they meet, they fall in love, they start a free love commune, and then they plot the assassination of an industrialist named Henry Frick. A lot of people know Frick because he was the president of Carnegie Steel at the time, very wealthy man. There's a museum in New York City called the Frick Museum. It's right next to what's the name of the big museum in New York? It's on that museum row. It was his city pied-à-terre. It's this great big huge mansion. So they get together and attempt to assassinate Henry Frick. And so the book is narrated by Berkman while he's sitting in jail, because he goes to jail for it. He's the trigger man.
Right.
And he's just reliving his life with this person, Emma Goldman. So it's kind of the opposite. In The Marriage of Rose Camilleri, you get a female narrator writing about her companion. And in this book, you've got a male narrator. It's written in a male voice, but he's writing about a woman principally.
Nice. Be good. I mean, any novel where we can have Russia painted in not such a great light right now would probably be good. And I know that
well, notice I'm wearing my I went to Value Village and I got a blue and yellow shirt to show my solidarity with Ukraine. I think that the blue tracks a little black on the screen, but I did my best.
Yeah, it might be that what was that thing, the blue dress or the gray dress or the purple dress or the green dress or something like that. I see blue and green, but maybe other people see purple and something else.
The people, viewing audience, this is blue and yellow.
Blue and yellow. That's great. Kaylee, do we have any questions from anybody?
Yeah, we have two questions so far. So the first question comes from David, and David asks, I saw a movie last night with a ridiculous plot and it was terribly written. We know great writing can elevate a movie or a book, but do you think that great writing can save a terrible or mundane plot?
Oh.
Yes. Yes. I made a few discoveries of writers over COVID. I discovered a few writers I really liked, and I read this book by this guy named Lars Eier. It's called Wittgenstein Jr., and it's about a university student who falls in love with this philosophy professor. Now, I never thought you would sell me on yet another story about a student falling in love with a teacher.
Yeah.
But I was amazed by how much I liked this novel. and it was all down to the writing.
Wow.
So yes, although I will say this, if you pick a trite storyline, one that's been done a million times, you better be a good writer.
Yes.
Because you're making things hard for yourselves. But yeah, writing can save things. Sure. I just wouldn't recommend it. You know, if you're trying to get published, don't think, you know what, I'm going to pick a plot line that's been done a million times and then save it with my own elevated writing style. You know.
Yeah.
Or this, my favorite novel, The Thought Gang. It's about bank robbers. You know, guys going around robbing banks, but it's just so absurd and weird, and the characters are so different that it carries it off, and that's all the writing.
Yeah.
So I would say yes. I vote yes on that one.
Yeah.
Although you got your work cut out for you.
I would agree. I mean, I really like I really like stories that are character driven. I mean, for me, I live and breathe for characters who do things that are unexpected and strange and spectacular and all that kind of stuff. And it's always a disappointment if the writing just doesn't match how spectacular the characters are.
Well, that was actually one of the challenges with The Marriage of Rose Camilleri. I was doing another book club the other day, and one person said, you know, I like this about this book. It's fundamentally a good book. It's a book where good things happen.
Yeah.
I think what he meant was the characters were good people.
Right.
And it's kind of rare to see books like that, because you want characters to generate their own problems. Otherwise, it feels like a soap opera. When the problems just drop out of the sky, it just feels like crappy genre fiction.
Yeah.
You know, for a while there, I was trying to learn Spanish, and I was watching Mexican telenovelas, and the problems were constantly dropping out of the sky. They were constantly going blind or getting in car crashes and losing the use of their legs, and then they would come back. You know, so good writers use really flawed, often naughty characters because they generate a lot of problems, and it feels natural that these people have problems because their personalities are so flawed that they just can't help but generate problems.
Yeah.
Why we like Tony Soprano, you know something's going to go wrong.
Right.
You know,
begging for it.
So that was actually more of a challenge to me, writing a book about good people, than writing in a woman's voice, quite honestly.
More challenging to write about good
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. Where do the problems come from if the people are good?
Right. Well, I mean,
they are flawed. So
they are flawed.
They do get in trouble a little bit. Anyway.
Yeah.
But there was another question, I think.
Yes.
Yep. And our second question is from Morel. And Morel asks, you mentioned writing a screenplay for your favorite book earlier. What do you think books can do that movies can't, and vice versa?
Ooh, good one.
Books provide almost a direct transmission into the inside of your characters' heads. And movies, it's a bit tougher because you just get a two-dimensional representation of the character from the outside. What movies can do is things like, they can put Brad Pitt in front of you. They can show you car crashes. It's just it's a hotter medium. So you can dazzle people more.
Yeah.
That's the difference, really. I often envy filmmakers for just how easy it must be to excite their viewers because of the tools they have at their use, particularly if they're successful, particularly if they have a lot of money to spend, like Martin Scorsese,
on getting great actors.
Yeah. So,
although I have felt there, I've watched a lot of movies where I have felt like an emotional intimacy with the characters. I think it really does it really does depend on the language, right? Like the writing and the evoking of the character within that writing. If an actor does it well,
Yeah.
how can you?
And there are plenty of novels that are very, very exciting and
Yes.
sexy to read, and visual, even though it's
Mhm.
just words on a page. I'm
Yeah.
just saying some mediums naturally accomplish things a little bit easier than others. You get, with every medium you select, there are pros and cons,
Yes.
you know, but
Yeah.
you still have to get there.
Yeah.
Uh,
I
Still
mean,
have to
the
do all
thing,
the time.
and the thing about novels, or the difference, like for me with novels and film, is the film, the imagery is given to you. And in novels, it's not necessarily given to you, right? Even though there's a
Yeah,
great description of Rose and Scott, they really are characters that live in my own head, right? Like you've created them for me, and I've read them and I've lived with them for the, day and a half that I spent with them. But if myself and 30 other writers of The Marriage of Rose Camilleri sat down and described those characters to a police sketch artist, they would probably come up with a
yeah.
bunch of different iterations.
That's why I'm never, like, a lot of my books are first person. I just like first person. I have written
Yeah.
third person novels, but I do like first person ones. And I never like reading from them because people have read the book will have created their own voice in their head. And I don't want to tamper with that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's funny when you told me that you weren't going to read from the book. I was like, oh, sad, because it's such a great thing to hear an author read. But then, and I think at that point I was probably only about halfway through The Marriage of Rose Camilleri. And then I read further and I thought, I'm actually grateful. I really am grateful that you gave
Now,
her to me.
I've gotten around this problem. There's a filmmaker in Toronto named Valerie Bahajer. She's got a new movie out right now, actually, but she's of Maltese descent, and she wants to make a television show from The Marriage of Rose Camilleri.
Oh,
And so she's getting me to do the writing on it. So that's been kind of keeping me busy, along with this book about Emma Goldman. But I've got some events coming up in which I'm going to get her to read from it, because she was an actor in the 90s. She
right.
still is, actually, but she was primarily an actor in the 90s. Now she's primarily a film director, but she can act, and she's female, and she can do a Maltese accent.
Right.
So
She's
you know,
perfect.
years ago, I was inspired by this, because years ago, when my first novel came out, it was called The Final Confession of Mabel Stark. I was doing a reading in London, England, with Jan Martel, who just won the Booker
Nice.
for Life Pie.
Mhm.
And the commonality between the two books is they both had tigers as a central character. So he showed up. I was like the support band, right?
Right.
I was the warm-up act. There's a million people at this huge hall, and he brought a reader. I thought, who was an actor.
Yeah.
I thought, how smart, because we writers, we're not actors. We can't do theatric readings. It's just not in our skill set, So why not get someone who really knows what they're doing? So that's what I plan to do in the future. She was going to do it today, but she's off showing her film at some festival in California. So maybe not too soon, you'll see The Marriage of Rose Camilleri,
that is
series.
So exciting. Yeah. And also share, before we do the raffle, share, Rob, any events that you've got coming up. If people are interested in seeing her perform a reading, then they can do that. And I will, you don't have to share them now. You can email them.
Okay, good.
I will post them when I put the video up.
Yeah.
So
for me to share them now, I would have to go hunting for my phone.
Yeah.
And that would be very boring visually for your viewers to watch me root around this messy office looking for my phone so I could find my Google Calendar.
Awkward silence that isn't really silence.
Yeah.
So we are going to raffle off a copy of The Marriage of Rose Camilleri, given to us by Douglas and McIntyre, the publisher. We have 2 copies of the book, so we're going to raffle off one right now, and then we are going to raffle one off in the coming week through social media promotion and an interview promotion and so on and so forth. So tell all of your friends that we've got another copy of this book up for grabs. Kaylee, who is the winner of
All right.
Camilleri?
Our winner for today is Patricia Fimio. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but Patricia F.
Yay! Patricia, thank you so much for, I've been watching the event. So thank you so much for joining us today. If you can either send me an email or contact me through social media, whatever you're comfortable with. My email address is junctionrights, WRITES @gmail.com, and send me your name and full mailing address. If you've already read the book and you want to nominate another person as the winner, you can also send me their name and mailing address, and Karina at Douglas and McIntyre will mail that off to you. Robert Hough, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was fun.
It was a great pleasure talking to you about this book, and I really appreciated having the opportunity to read it. It was a joy. And please, everybody, if you are interested in Junction Reads, check out our website, www.junctionreads.ca. Robert also has a website with links to all of his books, and that's roberthough.com. And
roberthough.ca.
.ca. Oh, sorry. That is I thought I copied and pasted that, but I guess I did not. roberthough.ca. And on April 10th, we are going to be joined with Stephen Hennigan and his book, The World of After. Thank you again, Rob.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
That's it. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kaylee. Good night, everybody.